You don't notice it at first, but there is a moment when an empath stops explaining, stops chasing, stops fixing what was never theirs to heal. And in that silence, something irreversible happens. They don't explode. They don't argue endlessly. They simply fade away from what no longer honors their peace. If you've ever wondered how someone so loving can suddenly become a stranger, listen closely. Because what pushes them away is never loud, it is repeated, it is tolerated, and it is ignored until it becomes unbearable. There are souls in this world who feel more than they speak. They absorb rooms, they read intentions, they sense truth behind every mask. And when you violate that sacred sensitivity, you are not just hurting them, you are teaching them who you are. The first thing that makes an empath disappear from your life is emotional dismissal. When their feelings are treated like overreactions, when their inner world is mocked or minimized, something inside them begins to close. Number T, out of anger, but out of wisdom. Because they realize they are pouring water into a vessel that refuses to hold it. Then comes dishonesty. Not just big lies, but the small, repeated distortions of truth. An empath does not need perfection, but they cannot survive in confusion. They are built to sense alignment. And when alignment is broken too many times, they stop trying to interpret what no longer makes sense. Manipulation is another silent killer of connection. When words are twisted, when reality is bent, when guilt is used as a leash, an empath feels it before they can explain it. And once they recognize that their emotional truth is being used against them, they retreat not to punish you, but to protect themselves. Understand this. An empath does not leave because they stop loving. They leave because they start respecting themselves more than the cycle they are trapped in. One of the deepest truths is this: empaths are not drained by love. They are drained by imbalance, if they are. The only ones showing up emotionally, listening deeply, repairing wounds, holding space, and forgiving repeatedly while receiving neglect in return, they will not stay forever. Even the most compassionate heart has a threshold where silence becomes healing. And when boundaries are crossed again and again, when no is ignored, when space is not respected, when emotional exhaustion is dismissed, they begin to see clearly. Love without respect is not love at all. It is consumption. There is also something more subtle: energetic environment. Constant chaos, constant conflict, constant emotional turbulence that overwhelms them. Not because they are weak, but because they are deeply receptive. And when peace is no longer possible in a place, they become strangers to it. And so they leave, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. They stop responding the way they used to. They stop explaining themselves. They stop trying to fix what refuses to grow. And one day, you realize you are no longer a priority in their emotional world, not because they became cold, but because they became clear. The divine lesson here is not about losing empaths. It is about honoring the sensitivity of human connection. Because those who feel deeply are not meant to be tested endlessly, they are meant to be respected, cherished, and met with truth. If you ever had an empath in your life and lost them, do not ask how to get them back. Ask what made peace leave your presence. Because empaths do not disappear from love. They disappear from anything that slowly turns love into suffering. Emotional invalidation is one of the deepest wounds an empath can experience, and yet it is often the most overlooked. On the surface, it may seem small, just a dismissive comment, a shrug, a laugh that cuts too sharply, or the familiar phrase, "you're overreacting." But for an empath, these moments are not small at all. They are signals. They are emotional data points that slowly shape their understanding of whether it is safe to remain in your presence. An empath does not simply hear words, they feel the intention behind them. So when their emotions are consistently minimized, they don't just feel unheard, they feel unseen. And being unseen is far more painful than being disagreed with. Disagreement still acknowledges existence. Invalidation denies it. At first, an empath will try harder. They will explain themselves more clearly, soften their tone, choose better words, even question their own emotional responses just to maintain peace. They will think, maybe I didn't express it right. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe they just don't understand yet. Because their nature is not to abandon, it is to understand, to heal, to bridge gaps that others ignore. But every time their emotions are dismissed, something subtle begins to shift within them. They start to lose trust not only in the other person, but in the safety of expression itself. They begin to wonder whether speaking up is worth the now cost. And this is where the quiet withdrawal begins, not suddenly, but gradually, like a door slowly closing without a sound. Emotional invalidation also creates an internal conflict in an empath. Their intuition tells them that what they feel is real and significant, but the external response tells them the opposite. Living in that contradiction is exhausting. It forces them into a space where they must constantly question their own inner world just to maintain connection with someone who refuses to meet them halfway. Over time, they begin to adapt in ways that are not visible at first. They speak less about what hurts them. They share fewer personal truths. They begin to filter their emotions before expressing them, asking themselves not, "What do I feel?" but "Will this be accepted?" And in doing so, they slowly disconnect from their own emotional authenticity just to preserve a bond that is already weakening. What many do not realize is that empaths are not fragile in the way people. Please assume they are resilient in silence. They can endure a great deal of emotional misunderstanding, but what they cannot endure is a constant rejection of their inner reality. Because once someone repeatedly tells them that their feelings are wrong, exaggerated, or unimportant, they begin to see that staying would require self-betrayal. And an empath may tolerate pain, but they will not survive long in self-betrayal. Eventually, emotional invalidation reaches a tipping point. It is not always marked by a dramatic argument or a final conversation. Sometimes it is marked by a moment of quiet clarity, a realization that no matter how clearly they express themselves, the response will remain the same. No matter how gently they speak, they will still be misunderstood. No matter how much effort they put into being heard, they will still be reduced, corrected, or dismissed. And in that moment, something powerful happens: not anger, not revenge, but release. They stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding them. They stop offering emotional explanations to someone who has already decided not to listen. And that is when the distance begins. From the outside, it may look like they suddenly changed, but internally, it is the result of countless small moments where their emotional truth was not honored. They are not leaving because they stopped caring. They are leaving because they finally started believing their own feelings again more than the words that dismissed them. Dishonesty may seem like a simple breach of truth on the surface, but for an empath, it is far more than that. It is a fracture in reality itself. Because empaths do not just process information logically, they process it emotionally, intuitively, and energetically. When honesty exists, their inner world feels aligned, stable, and grounded. But when dishonesty enters the space, even in small and repeated ways, it creates a silent confusion that slowly erodes their sense of safety. At first, an empath does not assume deception. Their nature is to give benefit of the doubt, to interpret inconsistency as misunderstanding, stress, or human imperfection. They will rationalize what they feel in order to preserve trust. They will tell themselves that everyone makes mistakes, that no one is perfect, that connection requires patience, because they are wired to connect, not to accuse. But the empath's intuition is always quietly working in the background. They notice patterns others ignore. They feel shifts in tone that do not match words. They sense when energy does not align with explanation. And even if they do not immediately act on it, they register it internally. Dishonesty does not need to be proven to be felt. It simply needs to exist. The most damaging part of dishonesty is not always the lie itself, it is the inconsistency it creates. When someone's words do not match their behavior, when promises are repeatedly adjusted or forgotten, when explanations shift depend on convenience, the empath begins to lose emotional orientation. They no longer know what is real in the relationship and what is performance. And that confusion is deeply unsettling for a mind that seeks emotional truth. In response, an empath will often try to understand before they withdraw. They will ask questions gently. They will observe more closely. They will attempt to connect the dots in a way that still preserves trust. They may even downplay their own suspicions, thinking that clarity will come with time. But each unresolved contradiction adds weight to their inner world. What makes dishonesty especially painful for an empath is that it breaks more than trust, it breaks resonance. Empaths naturally attune themselves to others. They synchronize emotionally, often absorbing not just what is said, but what is felt. When truth is present, this attunement feels harmonious. But when deception enters, it creates a kind of internal dissonance, like trying to tune into a frequency that keeps distorting. And over time, that distortion becomes exhausting. Eventually, the empath reaches a stage where they stop relying on explanations and start relying on patterns. They begin to trust behavior over words, silence over promises, consistency over reassurance. This is not because they have become cynical, but because their emotional system has adapted to protect itself from confusion. There is also a quiet grief that comes with realizing dishonesty has been present. It is not loud or dramatic. It is a slow internal acceptance that what they believed was stable may not have been, that what they felt as truth may have been partially constructed on distortion. And for someone who values emotional authenticity deeply, this realization is painful. Yet even then, empaths rarely leave immediately. They try to hold space for explanation. They try to understand intention. They search for reasons that can preserve connection without denying reality. But dishonesty has a cumulative, I have effect. Each small lie weakens the foundation a little more. Each inconsistency makes trust harder to rebuild. Each hidden truth creates emotional distance, even when physical presence remains. And then comes a turning point that is almost invisible from the outside. It is not a confrontation. It is not a dramatic ending. It is a quiet shift in perception. The empath stops expecting truth where it has been repeatedly absent. They stop asking questions that will not be answered honestly. They stop investing emotionally in clarity that never arrives. At that stage, withdrawal begins not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. Because an empath cannot build a stable emotional life on unstable truth. And once they recognize that honesty is not a consistent foundation in a relationship, they begin to step back not because they stopped caring, but because they can no longer afford to confuse connection with uncertainty. Manipulation does not always arrive in obvious forms. It is rarely loud in the beginning, and it does not announce itself as control. Instead, it often disguises itself as concern, care, emotional urgency, or confusion. And this is exactly why it affects empaths so deeply. Because empaths are not easily moved by surface behavior, they respond to emotional undercurrents. They feel intentions before they are fully revealed. And when manipulation enters a connection, it creates a distortion that their sensitive perception immediately detects, even if their mind takes longer to name it. At first, an empath tries to interpret manipulation through compassion. They assume misunderstanding before malice. They believe that emotional reactions are rooted in pain rather than strategy. So when someone shifts blame, twists context, or reframes events in a way that creates doubt, the empath does not immediately label it as manipulation. Instead, they try to understand the emotional cause behind it. They ask themselves what pain might be driving this behavior, what fear might be hidden underneath, what unmet need is expressing itself in distorted form. This is where their vulnerability becomes most exposed. Because manipulation often thrives in spaces where empathy is strong. The more an empath tries to understand, the more they may temporarily step away from their own clarity. They begin to question not only the situation, but their interpretation of it. And slowly, a subtle shift begins. What they felt clearly at first becomes less certain as external narratives begin to compete with internal truth. One of the most destabilizing aspects of manipulation for an empath is emotional gaslighting. This is when their feelings are repeatedly reframed as incorrect, exaggerated, or imagined. Over time, this creates a fracture between what they experience internally and what they are told externally. And for an empath whose entire emotional intelligence is built on trust in perception, this fracture is deeply disorienting. They may begin to second-guess themselves more often. They replay conversations, searching for where they might have misunderstood. They revisit emotional reactions, wondering if they were justified. And in doing so, they unconsciously begin to outsource their emotional authority. Instead of trusting their inner compass, they begin to rely on external validation to confirm what is real. Manipulation also often involves emotional leverage using guilt, obligation, or fear of abandonment to influence behavior. An empath who naturally values harmony and connection may initially respond by accommodating, adjusting, or sacrificing their own needs in order to restore peace. They may tell themselves that keeping the relationship stable is more important than insisting on their perspective. But this pattern slowly builds internal pressure, because every time they override their own emotional truth to maintain someone else's comfort, a part of them disconnects from themselves. They do not always notice this immediately. Why? From the outside, they may still appear understanding, patient, even supportive. But internally, they begin to feel increasingly drained, as if they are constantly managing emotional imbalance that never fully resolves. Another layer of manipulation that deeply affects empaths is inconsistency paired with reassurance. When someone alternates between affection and withdrawal, clarity and confusion, presence and absence, the empath becomes emotionally hooked into trying to restore stability. They begin to focus not on whether the connection is healthy, but on how to return it to its good version. This keeps them engaged in a cycle of emotional repair rather than emotional truth. But eventually, something within them starts to recognize the pattern. not all at once, but gradually. They begin to notice that clarity is always temporary and confusion always returns. That understanding is always followed by contradiction. That emotional peace requires constant effort from only one side. And this is where manipulation loses its hold. Because once an empath sees the pattern clearly, they no longer interpret it as isolated incidents. They begin to understand it as structure. And when something is recognized as a structure rather than a mistake, it can no longer be emotionally rationalized in the same way. The final stage is not confrontation, it is realization. A quiet internal acknowledgement that their emotional energy has been used to maintain imbalance rather than build mutual understanding. And in that realization, their behavior shifts. They stop explaining themselves as much. They stop engaging in cycles that lead nowhere. They stop trying to earn clarity from confusion. They do not always announce this shift. They simply begin to withdraw their emotional participation. And once that withdrawal begins, it is rarely reversed. Not because they lack forgiveness, but because they have finally understood that manipulation does not end through endurance, it only ends there. Awe distance. One-sided emotional taking is one of the most silent yet most destructive dynamics an empath can experience, because it rarely begins with obvious imbalance. It often starts with connection, with openness, with someone leaning on their understanding nature. And at first, the empath responds naturally, because giving is not something they do out of obligation, it is something that flows from their identity. They listen deeply, they hold space, they offer emotional presence without calculation. It feels natural, even meaningful, in the beginning. But over time, something subtle begins to shift. The emotional exchange stops feeling mutual. The empath becomes the place where everything is released, processed, and unloaded, while their own emotional world remains largely unseen or untouched. Conversations begin to center around the other person's struggles, their stress, their needs, their confusion. And when the empath tries to share their own emotional state, it is often short, bartended, redirected, or overshadowed by the other person's ongoing concerns. At first, the empath does not interpret this as imbalance. They are naturally inclined to understand and support. They may even feel honored to be trusted with someone else's emotional weight. But what they do not immediately notice is the slow depletion that begins when emotional energy flows in only one direction for too long. Because empathy, while expansive, is not infinite in its capacity to absorb without replenishment. One-sided emotional taking often hides behind urgency. The other person may always be going through something, always needing support, always having a new crisis, a new emotional wave, a new reason why attention must be focused on them. And the empath, being compassionate, continues to show up. They listen when they are tired. They respond when they need rest. They prioritize understanding over their own emotional space. But slowly, something begins to erode internally. The empath starts to feel like their presence is expected rather than valued. Like their role in the connection is to absorb rather than to be held. And even if they do not articulate it, they begin to feel emotionally invisible within a relationship where they are physically present. What makes this dynamic particularly difficult is that empaths rarely demand reciprocity in obvious ways. They do not usually keep score. They do not initially expect equal emotional exchange. But they do need emotional acknowledgement. They need to feel that their inner world matters as much as the one they are constantly engaging with. And when that acknowledgement is missing, a quiet form of exhaustion begins to settle in. There is also a subtle emotional loneliness that develops in one-sided dynamics. The empath may be surrounded by communication, by messages, by conversations, yet still feel deeply alone. Because being heard is not the same as being understood, and being used as an emotional outlet is not the same as being emotionally held. They begin to realize that their role is primarily receptive, not reciprocal. Over time, the empath may start to withdraw small parts of themselves without consciously deciding to. They share less of their inner thoughts. They respond with shorter emotional depth. They begin to conserve energy instinctively because their system recognizes imbalance even before their mind fully processes it. This is not coldness, it is adaptation. A quiet attempt to protect something that is slowly being drained. One of the most painful realizations for an empath in this dynamic is understanding that their presence is sometimes only sought when emotional support is needed, not when things are good, not when connection is neutral, not when their own emotional world could be the focus, but primarily when someone else requires release, clarity, or comfort. And that realization changes the emotional tone of the connection entirely. Because at that point, the empath begins to question what Either they are valued as a person or used as a resource. And once that question takes root, the dynamic can no longer remain the same. The empath begins to observe more than they engage. They start noticing patterns. Who initiates emotional contact? Who ends conversations? Whose needs dominate the emotional space? And how often their own needs are left unaddressed or postponed. Eventually, the imbalance becomes undeniable, not through a single moment, but through accumulated emotional exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, clarity forms. The empath understands that they are participating in a cycle where giving is constant but receiving is rare or absent. And while they do not resent deeply, they begin to recognize that sustained emotional depletion is not sustainable. At that point, they begin to step back not out of anger, but out of self awareness. Because an empath can give deeply, but they cannot remain in a space where giving is the only role they are allowed to occupy. Constant experiment. Loitation of kindness is one of the most subtle ways an empath's spirit is worn down, because it rarely appears as direct harm in the beginning. It often looks like trust. It looks like familiarity. It looks like someone leaning on their goodness, their patience, their willingness to understand. And an empath by nature does not guard their kindness as something scarce. They extend it freely, believing that compassion should be offered where it is needed. At first, this dynamic feels normal to them. They forgive easily, they help without hesitation, they give emotional space even when it costs them energy. They believe that kindness, when offered sincerely, will be met with respect. But what they slowly begin to encounter is something different to expectation forming around their softness. Their understanding nature becomes predictable. Their forgiveness becomes assumed. Their patience becomes a resource others rely on without considering its emotional cost. Exploitation begins when kindness is no longer appreciated as a gift, but expected as an obligation. The empath starts to notice that their boundaries are tested repeatedly, often in small ways that seem insignificant on their own. A request that disregards their time. A mistake that is repeated with the assumption it will be forgiven again. A situation where their emotional tolerance is stretched because they will understand anyway, and they usually do at least in the beginning. But every act of unacknowledged kindness carries weight. The empath may not express frustration immediately, because their instinct is to maintain harmony rather than disrupt it. However, internally, they are recording patterns. They notice when their generosity is not reciprocated with awareness. They notice when their emotional effort is taken for granted. They notice when their kindness is used as a safety net that others rely on without contribution or care. Over time, this creates a quiet emotional imbalance. The empath continues to give, but the energy behind giving begins to change. What once felt natural starts to feel draining. What once felt meaningful starts to feel repetitive. They begin to question whether their kindness is being received with respect or simply consumed without reflection. One of the most damaging aspects of this exploitation is that it often comes with selective appreciation. There may be moments where the empath is acknowledged, even thanked, even praised for their patience. But these moments are inconsistent and often follow periods of disregard. This inconsistency creates emotional confusion. It makes it harder for the empath to clearly define whether the relationship is balanced or draining, because positive reinforcement occasionally appears just enough to sustain hope. However, the empath's inner awareness continues to develop. They begin to notice that their kindness is often activated in emergencies, conflicts, or emotional needs of others, but rarely in moments of mutual or shared emotional presence. They start to see that they are positioned as the safe place, but not necessarily as someone who is equally held when they need safety themselves. This realization does not always lead to immediate withdrawal. Empaths are deeply tolerant, and they often give more chances than necessary. They may try to communicate gently, to set subtle boundaries, to adjust their availability. But exploitation often resists subtle correction because it thrives on what is unspoken and unchallenged. So unless clearly addressed and respected, the pattern continues. What makes this experience particularly heavy for an empath is that it conflicts with their core identity. They do not want to become guarded or cold. They do not want to withdraw their kindness entirely. So they remain in a tension between continuing to give and protecting themselves from being depleted. And that tension becomes emotionally exhausting over time. Eventually, a shift begins internally. The empath starts to observe their own behavior more consciously. They begin to notice when they are giving out of genuine alignment versus when they are giving out of habit, expectation, or emotional pressure. They start to recognize where their kindness is being reciprocated with awareness and where it is simply being used as emotional convenience. And once this awareness becomes clear, something changes in their energy. They begin to reduce unnecessary emotional access. They stop overextending in situations where their kindness is not respected. They begin to reserve their emotional depth for spaces where it is acknowledged rather than consumed. This withdrawal is not driven by resentment. It is driven by understanding. The understanding that kindness without boundaries eventually turns into depletion. And when an empath reaches that understanding, they no longer offer their softness blindly. They begin to protect it not because they have stopped being kind, but because they have finally let. That kindness must also include care for the self. Repeated boundary violations affect an empath in a way that goes far beyond simple frustration, because for them, a boundary is not just a rule or preference, it is an energetic limit that protects their emotional balance. When that limit is crossed once, they may explain it. When it is crossed twice, they may tolerate it. But when it becomes a pattern, something deeper begins to shift inside them. Not immediately in anger, but in awareness. An empath does not usually set boundaries in a rigid or harsh way at first. Their approach is often gentle, even flexible. They assume that if they communicate their needs clearly, others will naturally respect them. They believe in mutual understanding, in emotional respect, in the idea that people do not intentionally harm what they value. So when a boundary is crossed, their first instinct is not to withdraw it, is to explain again, to soften the message, to make it easier for the other people to understand. But repeated violations slowly begin to change how they perceive safety in a relationship. Each time a boundary is ignored, minimized, or tested, the empath experiences a subtle internal disruption. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a feeling of discomfort, a quiet sense of being overlooked, or a realization that their words did not carry the weight they expected. Over time, these moments accumulate. What makes boundary violations especially impactful for an empath is that they are deeply attuned to respect. They feel respect not only in words, but in behavior, timing, and emotional consideration. So when someone consistently crosses emotional, mental, or energetic limits, the empath does not just see it as a mistake, they begin to interpret it as a pattern of disregard. At first, they may try to adjust themselves instead of demanding change. They may become more accommodating, more flexible, more forgiving. They might tell themselves that relationships are equal or compromise, that not every boundary needs to be rigid, that understanding the other person's perspective is more important than enforcing personal limits. And while flexibility is healthy, overextension begins when their own needs are consistently placed last. As violations continue, something important begins to happen internally. The empath starts to lose trust in communication. They realize that expressing a boundary does not guarantee it will be honored. And this realization creates emotional fatigue, because now they are not only dealing with the violation itself, but also with the disappointment of unmet expectations. There is also a quiet erosion of self-respect that occurs when boundaries are repeatedly ignored. Not because the empath lacks self-worth, but because their efforts to protect their emotional space are not being reinforced by external behavior. This creates an internal conflict. They know what they need, but the environment does not reflect that need and stay. In that contradiction becomes increasingly draining. Eventually, the empath begins to change their approach. They speak less about their boundaries and start observing behavior instead. They begin to understand that words alone are not enough to create safety. They watch how often their limits are respected without repetition, how often their comfort is considered without reminder, how often their emotional space is protected without them having to insist on it. And in this observation, clarity slowly forms. They start to recognize that repeated boundary violations are not isolated incidents, but indicators of how their presence is being perceived, whether they are being treated as someone whose emotional limits matter, or someone whose limits can be adjusted for convenience. This realization is not always comfortable, but it is honest. Once that clarity sets in, the empath begins to reduce their emotional availability in subtle ways. They stop over-explaining. They stop repeating themselves endlessly. They stop trying to convince others to respect what should already be naturally honored. Instead, they begin to enforce boundaries through distance rather than discussion. This is not done out of punishment, but out of preservation. Because an empath eventually understands that constantly reinforcing boundaries in a space that repeatedly ignores them leads to emotional depletion. And once that pattern is fully recognized, they no longer rely on verbal correction alone. They begin to create distance where respect is absent, and in that distance, they regain something essential: their internal sense of safety. Persistent negativity and emotional chaos affect an empath on a level that is often misunderstood, because it is not just about being around bad energy in a superficial sense. It is about being constantly immersed in emotional unpredictability, unresolved tension, and environments where calmness is rare and instability is normal. For an empath whose system I S naturally receptive and deeply attuned, this kind of environment does not stay external for long. It begins to enter their internal world. At first, an empath may try to stabilize the environment around them. They bring calm into conversations. They try to soften conflict. They attempt to understand the emotional root of tension rather than react to its surface. They often believe that if they can just communicate properly or hold enough emotional space, things will gradually improve. Their presence becomes a grounding force in situations where chaos is frequent. But emotional chaos is not something an empath can endlessly neutralize. Over time, they begin to notice that the instability is not occasional, it is constant. There is always a new problem, a new emotional reaction, a new wave of negativity that resets any progress made toward calmness. And in this cycle, the empath starts to feel like they are not participating in a relationship, but an ongoing emotional turbulence persists. Tent negativity has a subtle but powerful effect on their inner state. Even when they are not directly involved in conflict, they begin to carry the emotional residue of the environment. Their thoughts become heavier. Their sense of peace becomes harder to access. Their emotional clarity, which is usually one of their strongest traits, begins to feel clouded by constant exposure to unresolved energy. What makes this especially challenging for empaths is that they are not avoidant by nature. They do not naturally disconnect from people in distress. In fact, they are often drawn to understanding pain, helping others process emotions, and bringing awareness to difficult situations. But there is a difference between supportive presence and continuous emotional overload. And when chaos becomes a permanent state rather than a temporary phase, the empath starts to lose their internal balance. They may begin to notice that even in moments of physical silence, their mind feels noisy. Even in months of separation, they still feel emotionally activated. This is because emotional overstimulation does not disappear instantly, it accumulates. And for an empath, accumulation of emotional intensity without restoration leads to exhaustion. At some point, they start to recognize that their nervous system is no longer in a state of rest around certain environments or people. Instead, it remains in a subtle state of alertness, anticipating the next emotional shift. This constant readiness drains their energy in ways that are not always visible from the outside. They may still function, still communicate, still show care, but internally, they are becoming increasingly depleted. Another important realization that emerges is that persistent negativity often resists resolution. It repeats in different forms but carries the same emotional weight. The empath begins to see patterns of conflicts that never fully resolve, complaints that never turn into change, emotional cycles that restart without growth. And this repetition creates a sense of stagnation, as if emotional progress is always being undone. Over time, the empath begins to understand that their presence alone cannot transform an environment that is consistently chaotic by nature. This is not a realization of defeat, but of limits. A recognition that emotional stability is not something one person can continuously supply in a space that does not support it in return. As this awareness deepens, the empath starts to shift their engagement. They become more selective with their emotional participation. They stop absorbing every emotional wave that enters the space. They begin to detach internally while still being physically present, creating a necessary distance between what is happening externally and what they allow themselves to carry internally. Eventually, this detachment becomes clearer and more intentional. They stop trying to stabilize environments that remain consistently unstable. They reduce their exposure to conversations, situations, or dynamics that repeatedly drain their emotional capacity. They begin to prioritize environments where calm is not temporary, but natural. This withdrawal is not driven by avoidance of people, but by preservation of peace. Because an empath eventually realizes that while they can understand chaos deeply, they cannot live inside it without losing their own emotional clarity. And when that realization becomes fully integrated, they choose environments that allow their sensitivity not to be constantly tested, but finally supported. In the end, the message is simple but profound: empaths do not disappear because they stop caring, they disappear because they start protecting the peace they once sacrificed too often. When emotional invalidation, dishonesty, manipulation, imbalance, exploitation, boundary violations, and constant chaos become patterns, even the most loving heart eventually chooses clarity over confusion and solitude over suffering. If someone who once stayed, understood, and forgave begins to step away, it is not rejection, it is realization. So honor the ones who feel deeply, because when they leave, they are not taking love away, they are taking their peace back. Thank you for listening. Take care of your energy, value your connections with truth, and goodbye.